My name is Marissa Caldwell. I'm 32 years old, and until last spring, I believed there were two kinds of debts in a family: the ones written on paper and the ones nobody kept track of, because love supposedly made the accounting unnecessary. I was wrong about the second kind. My boyfriend, Ethan Cole, had been telling me that for almost 2 years. Every time my parents called because the furnace died, the insurance jumped, or somebody needed money. Just until Friday, Ethan would watch me open my banking app and say, "One day they're going to forget this is generosity." I always defended them. I told him families helped each other. What I didn't understand was that my family had already stopped seeing my help as something I gave. They saw it as something they owned. The house was the reason I kept making excuses for them. It was an aging brick place with a deep backyard, a crooked maple tree, and a porch my grandfather had rebuilt twice with his own hands. My grandparents bought it decades ago and somehow turned it into the center of every important memory I had. Christmas mornings happened there. Graduation pictures happened there. My grandmother taught me to make biscuits in that kitchen. So when I found a county notice buried beneath insurance papers in my father's truck saying the property taxes were seriously delinquent, I felt physically sick. My father, Thomas, barely looked embarrassed when I confronted him. "I was handling it," he said. My mother, Elaine, stood at the sink and added, "Your father has been under a lot of pressure." Neither of them could explain where the money was supposed to come from. The amount needed to stop the situation from escalating was $9,400. I had the money, although it was supposed to remain part of my emergency savings. Ethan sat beside me while I stared at the transfer screen that night. "You understand nobody even asked you properly, right?" he said. "I knew. I transferred it anyway." The confirmation appeared on my phone at 10:17 p.m. I sent the receipt into our family group chat with a simple message saying the taxes had been handled and the house should now be protected. My father viewed it, my mother viewed it, my cousin Blake viewed it. So did Aunt Rebecca and my cousin Natalie. Nobody answered. Not even a thank you. Ethan glanced at the silent screen and said nothing because he didn't need to. 7 days later, Blake texted me about a Saturday cookout. Backyard, burgers, everyone coming. That sounded normal enough. Blake was my father's sister's son, and he had practically grown up in that backyard alongside me. I even owned the small studio apartment he rented across town, and because he was family, I charged him hundreds below market rate. Around 3 that afternoon, while I was getting ready, another message arrived from him. He said plans had changed. The gathering was only for direct family bloodlines, and I shouldn't come. I read it 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. I finally called him. He declined the call. Then I typed, "Blake, I'm Uncle Thomas's daughter." The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, returned, then vanished completely. I drove to my parents' house anyway. I wasn't looking for a scene. I wanted someone to explain the sentence that had just turned me from daughter into outsider. Cars already lined the street when I arrived. I could hear music behind the fence and smell charcoal from the grill. Before I reached the porch, my mother stepped outside and closed the front door behind her. That detail bothered me more than anything. She didn't invite me inside. "Mom, what is happening?" I asked. She folded her arms and looked toward the backyard instead of at me. "Please don't make today difficult." I showed her Blake's message. He says I'm not blood family. Her face tightened. For 1 second, I thought she was going to apologize. Instead, she said quietly, "It's easier if you accept that this gathering isn't for you." Something inside me went strangely calm. I could hear laughter behind the fence. Someone shouted Blake's name, followed by cheering. I asked my mother one final question. "Did Dad agree to this?" She didn't answer. That was enough. I walked back to my car, sat behind the wheel, and stared at the house I had spent $9,400 protecting for people who would not even let me through the gate. Ethan called while I was still parked there. I told him what happened. He stayed silent for several seconds before saying, "Do not do anything angry. Do something careful." That sentence changed everything. When I got home, I opened the account I had designated for any county reimbursement or tax adjustment connected to the payment. I froze outgoing access and enabled alerts on everything attached to the transaction. Then I started searching county property records. Nothing looked unusual at first. The owners were still listed exactly as before. But the following morning, an official notification appeared in my email stating that a title-related submission connected to the property was undergoing administrative review. 10 minutes later, my father texted me. Something happened with the title. Call immediately. No hello, no explanation. Just an order. I did not call. I pulled the public filing instead. There it was, a pending ownership petition submitted 48 hours after my tax payment cleared. The applicant was Blake Mercer, my cousin, the man who had decided I suddenly didn't qualify as family. He had represented himself as the intended successor to the property and claimed residency connected to the family's arrangements. The address he used to establish part of that connection made me laugh out loud from sheer disbelief. It was the studio apartment I owned. Blake was using property I rented to him at a family discount as supporting information in an attempt to gain control over another property I had just financially rescued. I called Ethan and read everything aloud. So the party, I began, was probably not just a party, he finished. I pictured the cars outside, the cheering from behind the fence, my mother already waiting on the porch before I arrived. Suddenly, her behavior made sense. Maybe they had assumed the filing was already secure. Maybe they believed that, after paying the taxes, I had completed the only role they needed me for. Fund the rescue. Stay quiet. Disappear before the celebration. The humiliation I had felt the previous evening hardened into something much more useful than anger. For 3 days, I let everyone believe I knew almost nothing. The family group chat filled with suspiciously casual messages. My aunt wondered aloud whether the county website was having technical problems. My father's suggested paperwork sometimes became confused after tax payments. Natalie asked Blake whether he had clicked something accidentally. I watched them manufacture innocence in real time. Meanwhile, I built a file. Bank confirmation. County receipts. Email exchanges. Screenshots. The notice I had found in my father's truck. Blake's ownership filing. His rental agreement showing that I owned the address he had used. I even located notes from the county employee who had explained the tax process to me before I transferred the money. Then I filed a formal fraud challenge. The county responded faster than I expected. The ownership request was frozen pending review, and a caseworker requested additional documentation. I sent everything. Only after that did I deal with Blake's apartment. He was already late on rent. Normally, I would have texted him twice, maybe 3 times, and eventually let him pay whenever he could. Not anymore. I contacted my property manager and told her to begin the lawful termination process according to the lease, document every step, and make no informal exceptions. We also prepared to relist the unit at its actual market rate once possession was legally returned. Blake called the moment he received notice. I watched his name glow on my screen until the call ended. His next message said, "Marissa, seriously? Over a misunderstanding?" I stared at that word. Misunderstanding. 2 days after I spent $9,400 saving the house, he filed paperwork trying to position himself as its future owner. 5 days after that, my family gathered behind the fence and told me I wasn't one of them. Now that the county had stopped the transfer and the apartment beneath Blake's feet was no longer guaranteed, suddenly everyone wanted to discuss misunderstandings. I opened a new document on my laptop and titled it, Caldwell Property, Complete Timeline. Then I began typing. Because if my family wanted to rewrite who belonged to the house, I was going to make sure the next version of the story came with receipts. By Monday morning, the Caldwell property file on my laptop had grown into 37 pages. Dates, screenshots, payment confirmations, county forms, Blake's lease, text messages, and a neat timeline of what happened before and after I transferred the $9,400. Ethan sat across from me at the kitchen table while I organized everything into folders. "You know what's strange?" he said. "Nobody has asked whether you're okay. I looked at my phone. 12 missed calls from my father, 6 from my mother, 3 from Aunt Rebecca, 2 messages from Natalie. Not one of them said, 'Are you okay?' Every message was some variation of, 'Call us before this gets worse.' That was when I finally understood the family definition of worse. Worse didn't mean someone had tried to take the house after I saved it. Worse meant I had noticed. Instead of returning their calls, I sent one email to every adult relative involved. The subject line was simple: property filing, documented timeline. I explained that I had paid the delinquent taxes. Blake had submitted his claim 2 days afterward. The county had frozen the request after my fraud report, and the address Blake used was a rental property that belonged to me. I attached copies of everything I could legally share. No insults, no accusations I couldn't prove. Just dates and documents. 22 minutes later, my phone started vibrating across the table. My father called first, then Aunt Rebecca, then Natalie. My mother texted, "Why would you send something like this to everybody?" I almost laughed. Blake had tried to alter ownership of a house, but somehow the offensive act was my forwarding the paperwork. Blake finally messaged me that afternoon. "You're making me look like a criminal." I replied with the first words I had sent him since this started. "I didn't fill out the paperwork." His response came immediately. "Everyone agreed it would stay in the family." I stared at the screen. That was the first accidental confession. Not an apology, not a denial. Everyone agreed. I took a screenshot and added it to the folder. Then another message arrived. "You were never supposed to make this public." I saved that one too. Ethan leaned over my shoulder, read it, and shook his head. "They keep telling you exactly what happened without realizing they're doing it." That evening, my grandmother June called. She was 81 and had spent most of her life believing family problems belonged behind closed doors. I expected another lecture about forgiveness. Instead, she asked me to come over. When I arrived, she was sitting at her kitchen table with Blake's name, handwritten on a notepad beside her. "He came here yesterday," she said. "Cried for almost an hour." I asked what he wanted. "He wanted me to tell you to stop." Grandma June looked exhausted rather than angry. I asked him whether he filed the claim. He kept telling me why he did it, instead of telling me he didn't. Then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. People who are innocent usually start with no. I felt something in my chest loosen. She wasn't choosing me because I was her granddaughter. She was choosing what she believed happened. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from an attorney representing Blake. It accused me of damaging his reputation and demanded that I stop distributing misleading statements. I read it twice before sending it to my own lawyer. His response was short: "Keep documenting and do not embellish." So I didn't. But I also refused to let my family turn the story into another private meeting where everyone pressured the person with the most to lose. I wrote an anonymized account online describing the tax payment, the exclusion, the suspicious ownership filing, and the county investigation. I removed surnames, addresses, and anything that could identify the property. I expected a handful of comments. By the following morning, thousands of people had read it. The part that frightened my family wasn't the attention. It was that strangers immediately understood the pattern. People kept asking the same question: why would they exclude the person who had just paid to save the house? Others pointed out that Blake's timing made the filing look planned rather than impulsive. My mother called again and left a voicemail saying Grandma June was upset, Blake was being humiliated, and I was turning a private mistake into entertainment. She never said the filing was fraudulent. She never said I had been wrongfully excluded. My father left a longer message asking me to remove everything before the county hearing. His voice sounded tired. "We can settle this among ourselves," he said. That sentence told me exactly what he wanted. Not truth, control. The hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. The county building was colder than I expected, all fluorescent lights and gray walls. Ethan offered to come with me. but I told him I needed to walk into that room alone. Blake arrived with Aunt Rebecca and an attorney who looked annoyed before the meeting even began. My parents sat behind them. Nobody greeted me. A county examiner reviewed the file and asked Blake to explain the basis of his ownership claim. Blake said the house had always belonged to the family, and that relatives had discussed keeping it under the branch that would maintain it. The examiner asked whether he had contributed to the delinquent tax payment. No. Whether he currently resided at the house? No. Whether he had written authorization from the registered owners granting him the authority he claimed? Blake looked at his attorney. Then the examiner asked about the address on his filing. Blake said he lived there. You rent that property? She asked. He nodded. From whom? Silence. Finally he said, Marissa. I watched my father lower his eyes. That was the moment the room changed. Until then, my family could pretend this was some complicated inheritance misunderstanding. Now the county had a much simpler picture. Blake had used an address belonging to the same cousin whose money had just prevented the family house from entering deeper trouble. When it was my turn, I didn't make a speech. I handed over the payment confirmation, the county correspondence, Blake's lease, his messages, and the timeline. I explained that I had not agreed to any change in ownership and had learned about the filing only after being excluded from a family gathering. The examiner paused at Blake's text, saying, Everyone agreed. She asked him who everyone meant. Blake said he was speaking emotionally. Then she asked why he had filed 2 days after my payment. He said he couldn't remember. His attorney whispered something to him. My mother started crying quietly. I felt almost nothing. By that point, tears had become another language my family used whenever facts stopped helping them. After a short recess, the examiner returned and announced that Blake's pending claim would be rejected because he had failed to establish a legitimate basis for the requested ownership change. The county would preserve the existing title status while any separate ownership questions were handled through proper legal channels. The fraud complaint remained documented in the administrative record. Blake didn't argue. Aunt Rebecca grabbed her purse and walked out first. My father looked at me as though he wanted me to say something that would make the room feel like family again. I didn't. Outside, Ethan was waiting near the steps with 2 coffees. Did you win? He asked. I thought about it for a second. I stopped them, I said. Winning felt like a different thing. Within days, my lawyer began the process of securing my financial interest and clarifying the property arrangements so nobody could casually attempt another transfer. Blake's former apartment was legally recovered, cleaned, and leased to a new tenant at normal market rent. The house itself was inspected, repaired, and placed under professional management while the deeper ownership issues were sorted out. I stopped paying family bills. I stopped answering emergency requests that somehow always involved money. The silence that followed was incredible. For years, I thought frequent family contact meant closeness. Apparently, a significant percentage of our communication had simply been invoices disguised as affection. My father showed up at my apartment the following Sunday. He stood outside holding nothing, which somehow made him look smaller. Your mother hasn't been herself, he said. Blake made a terrible decision, but none of us thought it would become this. I asked him one question. Did you know he was filing something? He looked away. That was my answer. He insisted they never expected the county to treat it as seriously as they did. We thought it would keep the house protected inside the family, he said. I felt my anger return, but it was quieter now. I was inside the family when you needed $9,400, I told him. Then I became optional when the paperwork started. He asked whether there was anything he could do. I told him the truth. You keep talking about how badly this ended. You still haven't said what you did wrong. A few days later, the remaining tax reimbursement arrived. After adjustments, it was close to the amount I had advanced. I transferred it into the business account connected to my properties and felt, for the first time in weeks, that something had been returned to its proper place. That evening, I updated my online post with the hearing outcome. I didn't name anyone. I didn't celebrate. I simply wrote that the claim had failed and the property would now be handled through documented legal channels. The comments flooded in anyway. Some people wanted revenge. Others wanted me to cut off my entire family. I closed the page. I had already learned that strangers loved dramatic endings. Real life rarely provided one. Mine arrived in an ordinary envelope. It was postmarked from another state and addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a 2-page letter signed by Catherine Caldwell, my father's older sister. Aunt Catherine had disappeared from our lives when I was around 12. No Christmas visits, no birthday cards, no explanation beyond my mother saying Catherine had chosen not to be part of the family anymore. The letter began. Marissa, I've been watching what happened with the house, and I think you finally deserve to know why I left. My pulse accelerated before I even reached the second paragraph. Near the bottom, she had written one sentence twice, underlined the second time. The house was never supposed to become your father's family property. I called Uncle Raymond before I called Catherine. The moment I said her name, he went completely silent. You knew where she was, I said. He exhaled slowly. Yes. I stood in my kitchen gripping the phone. For 20 years? Another pause. Marissa, she made me promise. Then he said something that turned the entire fight with Blake into something smaller and older than I had imagined. If Catherine is finally talking about the house, you need to listen to everything before you tell your parents you heard from her. That Saturday, I boarded a flight with Catherine's address folded inside my purse. I thought I was traveling to learn why my aunt disappeared. I had no idea I was about to discover that Blake wasn't the first person in my family who had tried to rewrite who owned that house. Catherine Caldwell lived 3 states away in a town small enough that the airport had only 6 gates, and the rental car clerk recognized half the passengers by name. Ethan wanted to come with me, but I told him I needed to hear whatever Catherine had to say without anyone else's reaction influencing mine. He kissed my forehead before I left and said, "Whatever she tells you, remember you don't have to decide what to do with it immediately." I carried that sentence with me all the way to Catherine's house, a modest one, story place hidden behind tall oak trees at the end of a narrow road. She opened the door before I knocked. I recognized her instantly, despite 20 years having passed. Older, thinner, silver in her hair, but unmistakably my father's sister. She stared at me for a second and said, "You look like your grandmother when she was angry." It was such an oddly specific greeting that I laughed despite myself. Catherine didn't. "That wasn't an insult," she said. "Your grandmother was dangerous when someone lied to her." We sat at her kitchen table for almost 2 hours before she showed me anything. She asked about Grandma June, Uncle Raymond, my job, Ethan, and even whether I still hated tomatoes the way I had when I was 10. The normal questions made the situation feel stranger. Finally, I asked why she disappeared. Catherine folded her hands and looked toward the window. "I didn't disappear, Marissa. I was removed." According to her, when my grandparents became ill, she had been the relative who handled almost everything. My father visited when he could. Aunt Rebecca appeared for holidays and emergencies, but Catherine was there every morning. She managed medications, drove them to appointments, slept on the living room sofa during my grandfather's final months, and eventually reduced her own working hours so they wouldn't need outside care. My grandparents knew exactly what that cost her. That was why, several years before they died, they had rewritten their will. "The house was supposed to come to me," Catherine said. I didn't answer. She continued before I could ask the obvious question. There had been other assets divided among the children, but the house itself was specifically left to Catherine. My grandparents believed she had sacrificed enough of her own life maintaining it and caring for them that allowing her to remain there was fair. Catherine said my father knew about the arrangement. So did Rebecca. Apparently, everyone did. Then my grandfather died, followed by my grandmother less than 2 years later, and when probate began, the signed original of that will could not be found. My father claimed my grandparents had discussed changing their minds. Rebecca backed him. Another relative insisted the only document anyone could locate was an older version that divided assets more broadly. And suddenly, Catherine said, I was being treated like a greedy woman trying to steal the family home. I felt cold despite the warm kitchen. Why didn't you fight? Catherine gave me a sad smile. I did at first. She hired an attorney, asked relatives for statements, searched my grandparents' files, and contacted the lawyer who had prepared the later will. But the attorney who drafted it had retired, records were incomplete, and Catherine had no original document. More importantly, she said, the family pressure became relentless. My father accused her of destroying everyone over property. Rebecca told relatives Catherine was emotionally unstable from caring for their parents. Phone calls stopped being conversations and became interventions. Eventually, Catherine realized she was spending thousands of dollars trying to prove something to people who already knew the truth. So she walked away. Your mother told everyone I chose distance, Catherine said. That part was technically true. What she left out was why. Then she stood, disappeared into a bedroom, and returned carrying a small fireproof document box. She placed it between us and unlocked it. Inside were old tax records, photographs, letters, medical paperwork, and a yellow envelope. Catherine removed several pages and slid them toward me. A scanned copy of the later will. My grandparents' names were at the bottom. 2 witness signatures. A notary stamp. The property address was unmistakable. I read the clause twice. The house had indeed been left specifically to Catherine. I looked up and asked the question that suddenly mattered most. Is this legally enough to change anything now? She shook her head. I don't know. A scan isn't the same as producing the original, and too much time has passed for me to pretend this is simple. I'm not giving it to you because I expect you to hand me a house tomorrow. She tapped the papers. I'm giving it to you because your father taught everyone a dangerous lesson years ago. If you control the story long enough, eventually people mistake it for ownership. That was when Blake's attempt stopped looking like an isolated betrayal. He had not invented the idea that family agreement could replace documents. He had inherited it. My father's generation had allegedly turned Catherine's inheritance into a communal asset by repeating the same version of events until nobody questioned it. Years later, Blake tried doing the same thing to me, only faster and more carelessly. Save the property with Marissa's money, file paperwork immediately afterward, surround the decision with enough relatives that it feels legitimate, then tell Marissa she is the problem when she refuses to accept it. Different decade. Same machinery. Catherine watched my face while the realization settled in. That's why I contacted you, she said. When I read what happened, I felt like I was watching my life with different names. I called Uncle Raymond from Catherine's kitchen. He answered on the second ring. I'm sitting with her, I said. He was quiet. And I've seen the will. Another silence. Finally he said, Then there's nothing left for me to protect. Raymond admitted he remembered my grandparents discussing the later will. He also remembered the chaos after their deaths, and Catherine being treated like an enemy for insisting it existed. He had been younger, intimidated by my father, and desperate to avoid becoming the next person pushed out. He never claimed to have seen anyone destroy the original, and Catherine never said she had proof of that. But Raymond confirmed something equally painful. The family had known Catherine's claim was not some delusion invented after the funeral. They simply chose the version of events that benefited the largest number of them. I should have spoken, he said. I didn't. It was the first clean admission I had heard from anyone in months. I flew home Sunday carrying copies of Catherine's documents in my bag. I didn't confront my parents immediately. Ethan met me at the airport, and when we got home, I spread everything across our dining table. He read quietly. What are you going to do? He asked. 3 months earlier, I would have said expose them, send another email, post everything, make sure every relative knew. But something had changed. Public humiliation had already given me the truth about Blake. He cared about consequences, not remorse. I didn't need another audience to learn the same thing about my father, so I called an attorney who specialized in estates and property disputes and paid for a private consultation. I gave her Catherine's scanned will, probate records we could obtain, the county history, and the recent fraudulent claim. Her answer was careful. The age of the estate, absence of the original will, prior probate actions, statutes of limitation, and later transfers made reopening everything complicated and potentially impossible. But the documents were still valuable evidence of the family history, and Catherine might have options depending on records that survived. For once, I didn't need a dramatic legal promise. I only needed the truth separated from revenge. Then I invited my parents to meet me at the house. Not my apartment, not a restaurant, the house. My father arrived first, followed by my mother. Ethan stayed inside, but gave us privacy in the dining room. I placed Catherine's scanned will on the table where my grandmother used to serve Thanksgiving dinner. My father saw Catherine's name before he sat down. His face changed instantly. My mother whispered, "Where did you get this?" I asked my father instead, "Was Catherine supposed to inherit this house?" He stared at the paper for a long time. Then he started doing what he always did, explaining context. Catherine was exhausted. Granddad changed his mind constantly. The siblings believed keeping the property available to everyone was more reasonable. Nobody knew whether the later document was still valid. I interrupted him. "That isn't what I asked." He rubbed his forehead. "Marissa, this happened decades ago. Was she supposed to inherit it?" Finally, he said, almost too quietly to hear. "At one point, yes." My mother immediately tried to soften it. "Your grandparents wanted everyone together." I looked around the dining room and almost laughed. The house supposedly preserved family unity so successfully that one daughter had vanished for 20 years and another had recently been banned from its backyard after paying $9,400 to save it. I asked my father whether Blake knew Catherine's history. He insisted Blake knew only fragments. Then I asked whether my father had supported Blake becoming the future owner. He hesitated. That hesitation hurt more than the answer. "We discussed possibilities," he admitted. "We thought someone younger should eventually take responsibility." I said, "You mean someone younger who wasn't me?" My mother said I was making everything sound malicious. I looked directly at her. "You stood on the porch and told your own daughter not to enter a house she had just saved. You don't get to complain about how that sounds." For the first time, my father apologized without attaching an excuse. Not for everything, not enough to magically repair us. But he said, "I should have stopped it. I knew Blake was talking about filing something, and I convinced myself it was harmless because I thought we could fix the details later." There it was, the truth I had been waiting for. He had known. My mother started crying, but I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. I told them Catherine was alive. I had spoken to her, and she possessed records contradicting the family story I grew up hearing. My father closed his eyes. "Is she coming back?" he asked. "That depends on her," I said. "But whether she comes back or not, you don't get to erase her again." Over the following months, Catherine worked with her own attorney to determine what, if anything, could still be corrected legally. I refused to claim certainty where there wasn't any. Maybe the old estate could be challenged. Maybe it couldn't. Maybe financial settlements would make more sense than trying to unwind decades of property history. What mattered to me was that Catherine finally had evidence, witnesses, and someone willing to stand beside her, rather than tell her keeping quiet was the price of belonging. I also made a decision about the house. I would no longer treat it as sacred simply because my family told me it represented our history. Buildings do not preserve families. People do. And the people attached to that building had used nostalgia like a lock. Blake eventually sent one final message. He said he had lost his apartment, several friendships, and whatever trust Grandma June once had in him. He wrote, "I hope this was worth it." I looked at the sentence for a long time before answering. "You still think the consequence is what I did to you. That's why nothing I say will help." Then I blocked him. Natalie stopped contacting me. Aunt Rebecca never apologized. Grandma June remained in my life, although she struggled with Catherine's revelations because admitting the truth meant reconsidering decades of family history. Uncle Raymond called Catherine personally and apologized for staying silent. She didn't forgive him immediately. I respected her more for that. As for my parents, our relationship became smaller and more honest. No emergency transfers, no financial rescues, no pretending a Sunday dinner could erase what happened. Ethan and I started building traditions that didn't depend on proving loyalty through money. Catherine came to visit 6 months later. She stood in front of the old house for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. I expected anger. Instead, she touched the porch railing and said, "I spent half my life thinking losing this place meant they won." Then she looked at me. Turns out, leaving was how I survived them. That sentence stayed with me. I used to believe I paid $9,400 to save a house. I know better now. The payment simply pulled on a loose thread, and once I started pulling, decades of carefully folded family history came apart in my hands. Blake thought he was stealing a property. My parents thought they were protecting a legacy. Catherine thought she had buried her past forever. And I thought blood automatically meant belonging. We were all wrong about something. The difference was that some of us were finally willing to admit it. The house still stands beneath the old maple tree, but I no longer look at it as proof that our family survived. I look at it as proof that truth can survive longer than the people trying to hide it. And sometimes the person a family pushes outside is the only one left holding the key to what really happened.